right, class, well, welcome here to, we're going to call this one 28.2.1. The reason for that is that this section right here, when we talk about Vietnam, is a very large section that encompasses a lot of social issues, but then it also covers the war pretty extensively. This doesn't necessarily fall as long as, this is not going to be as long as my World War II lectures, of course, but the war in Vietnam does stretch out for an incredibly long time, and America's involvement in it is quite extensive. So there's a lot of different elements that we want to talk about with the war itself and also the social disruption that comes with the war in Vietnam. Now, admittedly, too, I'm just going to be upfront here and honest. I am probably going to mess up on a number of these names for the Vietnamese, so I apologize in advance. Now, these lectures probably are going to be a little bit longer too, so I apologize right off the bat for taking up more extensive time than normal, okay? But I'll try to be as brief as I can, yet give you the most information I can provide you. So let's just start off here, and there's one thing that I want you guys to pay attention to at this very first part of this lecture, okay? And there is a warning for once. On slide 8 of this PowerPoint, there is a couple very violent and graphic images on there, okay? Now, if you're not wanting to look at them or if your parents have a problem with them, it is going to be slide number 8. Go ahead and skip over that one and that part of the lecture. And one of the things is that I did not put any questions on the quiz for any of the underlined information on that slide. So if you feel like you just need to go ahead and skip it, feel free to do so. But this is just a warning early on, and it's not like the Holocaust graphic, but there are some images that are disturbing, okay? And we're going to probably have a couple times where in the Vietnam War, there's some very poignant and powerful pictures that come out during this time frame. And there's some of the most powerful images of the 20th century. So occasionally they're going to be on there. And if there's going to be images like that, I'm going to be very clear and upfront with you guys of what you're going to be looking at, okay? All right, let's go ahead and just get started with Vietnam. All right, so Vietnam itself, when we talk about the country, never really had a unique identity going into the Vietnam War. Historically, it had been part of what was known as Indochina, and throughout pretty much its entire existence, it has been in some form of conquest or non-unified government, or just lumped in together with multiple other nations. So the idea of Vietnam is a very new idea when we look at the Vietnam War. Now, of course, they do keep somewhat of a separate cultural viewpoint, but again, it's kind of a mashup of a number of cultures. You have to understand that there's a lot of Chinese influence here. There's some Japanese influence. Overall, Vietnam itself, when it finally breaks away and becomes its own nation, this is a very new step for them. Now, to give you a relative size of how big Vietnam is, it's about the size of California. So when you're trying to look at it and you're trying to figure out how big it is, that is about where we're looking at wise, okay? Now, when we also talk about Vietnam too, we're going to talk about a North and South Vietnam. And you're going to probably look back and go, well, didn't they have a North and South Korea? Which somewhat, yes, you have a northern communist country of Vietnam and you have a southern supposedly free democratic South Vietnam, but we'll talk about that. There's a lot of issues with the South also, okay? But another distinct difference is that Korea itself, from a climate and from a landmass type situation and style, geographically, they're vastly different from each other. And so that also plays a factor into how this war is fought and how it is different from Korea too, okay? When we look at Korea, they have wintertime, they have snowfall, they have more of a temperate region, whereas Vietnam is truly a jungle. It is hot, it is humid, you can get all sorts of diseases from there. So Vietnam is an entirely different type of war comparative between Korea and this war itself. So you got to understand that going into the war of some of these differences, because it does play a factor out on how the war is fought too, okay? Another thing is, though, to understand is that North Korea had an established army, and then it had backup from China itself too. And they're fighting more conventional military styles. They're using tanks, they're using artilleries, there's fighter planes. Vietnam doesn't really have most of those things. They don't typically have large tank formations that they can bring down. They do have artillery, and they're very inventive with their use of artillery, but they're not like a full-fledged, formed-up military with established units for the most part. They're more guerrilla fighters. They show up out of nowhere, and they hunt you down and they kill you. Do they still come in masked man formations? Yes, they do, of course, because in order to attack a large enemy, you still have to amass large numbers of troops. However, they're very stealthy the way they fight, and they're used to doing what's known as hit and run attacks, where they would show up, they would take on a superior force, they would strike it, and then they would disappear and melt away into the jungle. And this is one of the reasons why the French have such an hard time with it too, because they're not fighting a traditional military state. They're not fighting a traditional military force where you just look at it and you say, that's the enemy, this is where their strongholds are, we are going to go ahead and just annihilate them. Instead, the North Vietnamese and and Ho Chi Minh and a lot of people that are along with it, they have support in the South, very distinct support that also undermine the ability for the French and the Americans during this time frame. We're going to talk briefly about the French just to start off here, because there is a lot of important information that comes along with the French. All right, so let's talk about it. Okay, so France had been a colonial power. Remember, we've talked about this expansion, colonialism. One of the things, though, is that France had historically controlled the region known as Indochina. Okay, so those encompass Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia as to what we know them now. They were split and they were separated off later on. But during this time frame, France owns Indochina, or they occupy it's the best way to put it. And they've been there for quite a while. Now, is there good guys and is there bad guys in Indochina? Well, let's put it this way. The French were definitely, if you want to look at it from a historical perspective, they were not the good guys. If anything, they were just as rough and as cruel as any southern slave owner would have been on their population. They specifically gave land grants to rich upper class people that had large properties, almost plantation style properties. They would often work the Vietnamese people very hard, give them very little money if there was any money involved. Basically, most of the people that were working near these plantations or on these plantations were treated nothing more than like it's slave labor. There was lots of violence. There was a lot of cruelty. So all in all, the French, they do not establish themselves as merciful leaders of this region of Indochina. Instead, they are, just by nature of how abusive and how cruel they are, they pretty much foment revolution against themselves because they cannot go ahead and take up a populist front. They cannot get the hearts and minds of the people to agree with them because they've just not been good to the people themselves. They've been cruel. So that's one of the big problems. Now, during World War II, because France and Britain couldn't necessarily keep their colonial holdings and be able to fight off Hitler at the same time, especially the French, who fall very quickly, Japan moves in and fills that power vacuum in a lot of regions and territories that had historically been controlled by the British and the French. So the Japanese occupy Indochina for quite a while. And eventually, once they lose the war, they're forced back out again. And the United States kind of turns a blind eye and says to France, go ahead, go back into Indochina. We're not going to get in your way. We're going to let you get in there, but we're not going to support your attitudes towards these people, yet we're going to support your government. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that Ho Chi Minh actually arises during this time frame, especially when there's occupation by the Japanese. And Ho Chi Minh, he's a revolutionary. He has traveled extensively. He's educated in Western universities. He speaks 3 languages. He speaks Chinese, He speaks Vietnamese and he speaks French, so he's well educated. And he goes back over to Vietnam to really try to foment a nationalistic uprising. Now, initially, was Ho Chi Minh a communist? Some people ask that question because there's often the dispute, or people look at it and they go, well, was he really a communist or was he a nationalist? And when we think about this and we start talking about Ho Chi Minh, initially, yeah, he is a nationalist. He wants to free Vietnam. He wants to make Vietnam its own free country. However, he had always been a hardcore Marxist. There's numerous pictures of him with Stalin and with Mao, and so he's definitely in the communist camp. There's no one way or another around it. He's definitely entrenched in communist ideals. And when he goes to Vietnam and he's talking about fomenting revolution and setting up Vietnam as its own independent country, he does so with Marxist leanings. So don't think anything else around that one there. But again, after the end, once Japan is kicked back out, the United States basically we support France again in Indochina. Now, one of the things, though, is that Ho Chi Minh, he sets up and he really starts to foment revolution against the French. Okay, and we've already talked about kind of how France ruled like dictators, and they were cruel and horrible towards the Vietnamese during this time. And so Ho Chi Minh, he shows up, and not only does he oppose French rule, but he also starts to establish kind of those Marxist ideals where he looks at the people who are at the top, and he says these people control all the wealth, they control all the power, they're in the pocket of a foreign power, they're in the pocket of the French, they're colonialists, and we really need to foment revolution. And if we foment revolution, the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to divide that land up equally among the peasant population. We're giving them a shot at economic security and prosperity. So he really pushes the people and gets them behind him too. And one of the things too is that America's looking at this, and America's kind of seeing that France is not necessarily in a stable position. And this is in the 1950s, so this is not directly after World War II. This is removed probably by about close to 7 to 10 years during this time frame that France is trying to reoccupy its Indochina empire. But the United States also looked at France in general. Remember, we were talking about the fragility of Europe and how it was suffering economically. And this is one reason why the French wanted to regain control of their Indochina empire so that they could get more wealth and more mineral resources. One of the things about Vietnam is it was very rich in rubber. It did have access to some things like oil and a few other important natural resources that the French could exploit and use. That's why they were still there. It wasn't that they were just trying to occupy a jungly region. Instead, there was real motivation because they could turn a profit by being in that area. And so one reason why the United States just basically lets France move right back in again is because of France's economic issues. Now, one thing to understand about France is that France had entertained the ideas of hardcore socialism and also communism at certain points throughout its history. And so the thought of an actual communist government rising up and coming into power in France was an actual real fear that the United States had. So that's another reason why they backed the French so hard in this, is because they're looking at it and they're going, we can't let the French state fall into communism. I mean, where would we be at that point? And also, you get to understand, again, this is all happening under Eisenhower's administration. And if you guys remember doing your paper on the domino theory, this too was something that the United States was looking at. If we could back the French, we're not going to have a communist government take over and start to rule Vietnam. So what do we do in order to back the French? Well, the war starts becoming unpopular in France. And soon people are going, well, how can we fund this too? This is costing a lot of money. So the United States steps in, and one of the things that we do is we start to finance the war basically for France. I mean, we're giving them like $2 billion here and there. We're funding 80% of France's military at a point, and 98% of the South Korean military is also what we're funding. So we are paying huge sums of money. One of the really interesting facts about this is that they say France fought with American tanks, American jeeps, American helicopters, American guns, and American-made uniforms. So they said when the French were there and they were fighting, and then when the United States moves in and replaces them, the Vietnamese, they don't look at that and differentiate between the two powers, because basically they have been fighting people that look just like us since the very beginning. And I'm not just saying just like us, like white Europeans. I'm talking about from the perspective of the equipment that we're using too. So it's kind of an interesting look at that viewpoint when we just move right in and take over the French's position, that the Vietnamese, they don't see any differences between the two. Okay, anyways, the French were, again, when we looked at it, they were plagued by hit and run attacks. In the United States, we really put military advisors in place to try to support and help the French fight the Vietnamese. And so one of the things that we do is we really push them to start trying to take them on a decisive battle. Now remember, I've talked about this so many times about military commanders trying to find a decisive battle to take on the enemy and crush them. And it doesn't work out necessarily very often in history, does it? But that's one of the things that the United States really pushes for. They say, bring them out to an area that we know we can attack them. We will then overwhelm them with superior air power, artillery, tanks, and weapons, and we'll be able to crush them and finally end this revolt after all. However, one of the things is that the Vietnamese, they were really great at using what was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this, they would use bicycles. So if you can see some of those pictures I have off the side, they'd use bicycles, and they would also walk, and they'd be able to tear apart an entire artillery piece and move it piecemeal down this trail. And they would then be able to set up and surround French positions, rebuild their artillery within the cover of the jungle, and be able to attack them. And so the big battle that really escalates and pushes France, where they say, all right, here's where we're going to go. We're going to go to Dien Bien Phu, and we are going to put a superior force, a large military force, somewhere around 15,000 men, and we're going to take them on here, because this is where we know that they are moving their supplies through. This is where we have the technological advantage. We're going to airdrop in there, and we're going to prepare, and we're going to fortify our position, and we're going to take that fight to the enemy. And it doesn't go as they plan. In fact, even with all the parachute jumps, one of the things is they lose a couple of their main commanders in those jumps. They have to be evacuated back to hospitals. And basically the North Vietnamese, they overwhelm the French, and they end up causing the French to have to withdraw. And all their technologically superiority was basically blunted by the jungles of Vietnam. And they underestimated the amount of men and material that the North could bring down and bring against them. It's one of the biggest things. We talk about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This becomes a problem for the Americans too. And throughout the war, we try to destroy it. Both sides do. The French try to, the Americans try to. We try to run massive bombing campaigns, much to ineffect. All right, let's move on from the French. I know way too much about the French end of this war. Okay, so one of the things, though, is that the French, they pull out, okay? They leave, and once they leave underneath the Geneva peace treaty talks that they have, they split the Indochina up into 3 separate countries. Now, the United States kept looking, they said, well, we'll take North Vietnam right now, but we want to keep South Vietnam free. And General Matthew Ridgway, he was an advisor that had been in and out of Vietnam, and he basically said to Eisenhower, he said, the French are gone. We need to pull out too. It's just not worth the manpower. We're going to have to commit hundreds of thousands of troops to the region if you want to hold this. And even then, we're not fighting a traditional military power, so perhaps the best thing to do is to walk away from Vietnam. And one thing, though, is that Eisenhower, being, a 5-star general at one point in his career, didn't really like what Ridgway had to say. And so he ends up firing Ridgway. And he goes, no, we're going to continue moving advisors. We're going to get further entrenched in there. And the other thing is, too, is that the United States backs another government that is not any better than what the French left behind. So the people that we put in there, Nguyen Dinh Diem, he basically was a dictator in the South. And so again, this goes against what Ho Chi Minh is preaching. Ho Chi Minh saying we're fighting for a free and independent Vietnam. We don't want to be tied necessarily to China and the Soviet Union. We want to make sure everybody gets equal distribution of land and abilities. And the South is just basically just another extension of the French state, because Diem had been underneath the French too, and he spoke French, and he had a lot of connections to the French government still. And another thing is that he really was culturally different from them. He was a Catholic compared to the Buddhist majority. There's a reason why that comes into play. So one of the things, though, that the Americans kind of demand and ask for is that free and fair elections. That's something constantly that we're trying to push and pursue. However, again, we tend to back despots throughout the Cold War, unfortunately. So when they looked at setting up those elections, it became pretty apparent that Ho Chi Minh was going to win in the South. And so Diem he shut down elections and basically became a dictator of the region. Now, this next slide is the one that I was telling you guys about. If you are not ready to see it, please do not proceed past this point in the video and just kind of fast forward until you get to the next section, okay? Or just look at the PowerPoint. Pretty much everything that I've done this time is going to be on the PowerPoint for your questions. All right, so let's talk about Diem a little bit more. Okay, Diem had been a backer of the French, okay, and he was Catholic. We just covered that. One of the things, though, is he persecuted Buddhist monks, and he persecuted the Buddhist people. And this made him wildly unpopular, to the point that in protests, as you can see in the central picture, that Buddhist monks would actually go out in the center of town, douse themselves in gasoline, and light themselves on fire. And yes, they would die. And this was one of their protest movements. And this happens quite frequently throughout the country itself. And so this just enrages people further, that that Dinh is not willing to make any concessions. He's trying to push unpopular policies, and eventually he starts to create chaos and and he destroys any unity in the South too. And one of the reasons why this is a problem is because now those in the South are starting to sympathize with those in the North. And the North is able to infiltrate into the South very easily because of the unpopularity of Diem's policies. So the United States, what do? Well, they figure that Diem is too much of a problem at this point, and backed by the CIA, they basically run a coup against Diem and have him killed by a group of military dissidents who then take control of the country. So yes, Dinh is assassinated basically by the backing of the United States government. So let's talk a little bit about the Viet Cong. That's what they become known as. This is the Army of Liberation. And we've talked about how they are not a traditional military force. They often would just dress in like a loose-fitting type of pajama that was very common with the southern and northern Vietnamese farmers. And so it was very hard to differentiate them. Now, occasionally, yes, they wear some sort of military uniforms, yeah, as you can see in the pictures, but they more so try to blend in with the local population and be able to take the Americans by surprise. And this becomes an issue later on in the war because America engages in some pretty horrendous activities to try to flush these Viet Cong troops out of villages. And so you get some war crime issues that start to occur because of the integration of the Viet Cong into the civilian population. Eventually it leads people to do drastic things which they shouldn't necessarily do. And again, what I talked about is that the South basically, they supported, Ho Chi Minh. It wasn't like we were backing the democratic popular leader of Vietnam. And so this, again, pushes them further into the arms of Ho Chi Minh. And this is why, Ridgway says we need to just leave Vietnam. There's no way we're going to gain popular support in this country for this war. We just need to leave. It's just not going to be worth the men and the lives and the material and the cost to fight a war there. So, what do we look at next? Well, Eisenhower leaves and Kennedy takes over, John F. Kennedy. And he, too, had been advised, don't get involved in Vietnam. It's a mess. Do not do it. It's going to just cost lives. You need to pull back. We need to remove ourselves from this quagmire before it gets too much. However, remember we talked about last time about his flexible response key, where he was going, well, we're going to fight conventional warfare instead of resorting to nuclear war. And this is one of the very first places we can try out this idea of flexible response, where we can send in conventional military units to push back against communism. Now, this is, again, he's looking at it from also the domino effect viewpoint, okay? Also, United States, he was told by McNamara, they said, basically, we have superior equipment, superior aircraft, and we can put more men on the battlefield than they possibly can. So we can go ahead and just overwhelm them with superior firepower and manpower. So this shouldn't be a problem. We should be in and out of there pretty quick, and we should be able to defeat the communists. And so, under Kennedy, we start to send more advisors, quote-unquote advisors, and up to the point of there's about 16,000 advisors over helping the South Vietnamese. And pretty soon, they're on the front line fighting also. They're no longer just taking an advisory role. They're actively engaged in fighting against the Viet Cong. And this leads to more and more troops being brought and stationed over in Vietnam. One of the things, though, is McNamara, who is his Secretary of Defense, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense. He's one of those people that was considered one of the whiz kids. He comes from business background, and Kennedy really relied upon him and listened to McNamara's ideas and his goals of how he would run the Defense Department. And the other thing is that both of them really shut out the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they run it through a couple other military commanders, effectively pushing off to the side these men who are experienced and could have been able to guide them and give them ideas. Instead, Kennedy and McNamara thought they could basically micromanage the war and that they could handle it themselves. All right, so we're going to talk about now what is commonly referred to as the crime of the century. So we're going to move just a little bit past Vietnam because we need to talk about this next section because it is critically important in American history and also why the course of the Vietnam War shifts. All right, so in 1963, John F. Kennedy decides he's going to visit Dallas. And so in November 22nd, he goes down to Dallas, Texas, and he's there to give a speech and talk about how him and the Soviets are working on trying to ban open-air nuclear tests and how they're trying to push for what's known as the START treaties to limit the number of nuclear weapons that both sides keep. And so he's going down to the South, and he's going to try to push his idea and his agendas down there. Now, during this time, you need to understand that Kennedy, he's made a lot of different enemies. He's upset the Cubans, especially Castro, by trying to assassinate him. He's upset the Soviets, of course, and the same thing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He'd really started to put a lot of pressure, and especially his brother Robert, who was the Attorney General, starts to really pressure the mafia too. And finally, he's upset those Cuban nationals because he pulls out all support for them right before right during the Bay of Pig invasions. And so, because Kennedy had a number of high-profile people that were angry with him, the Secret Service was very protective of Kennedy. And they said to him, "Sir, when you go down to Dallas, Texas, we think it's best that you put on the protective cover of your vehicle that's bulletproof." Kennedy declines. He's like, I really want to see the people. They want to see me. I'm here on a goodwill tour because he wasn't necessarily beloved in Texas, and he was trying to reestablish it. It's one reason why he had Lyndon B. Johnson run with him, because Johnson could bring in the Texas vote. And now Kennedy was trying to use his charm and his wit to be able to bring Texans into him. Well, because he doesn't put the armored top on his vehicle, this ultimately leads to his death. As they pass by what is known as the Texas Book Depository, Lee Harvey Oswald is perched up there with a rifle, and he aims and he shoots Kennedy and hits him twice. He also wounds a number of other people inside the vehicle itself, but he manages to hit Kennedy even one time in the head. And Kennedy is not killed right away, but he dies later on in the hospital. And as you can see, the famous pictures over here on the middle portion, that's his wife crawling out of the back end of the vehicle, and Kennedy slumped against her. And the Secret Service, they try to respond the best they can. They try to take him in to the hospital, but he does die, and Lyndon Johnson does take over as president. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald, he tries to escape. He ends up killing a Texas police officer and is taken into custody and charged with killing President Kennedy. Now, a few days later, Oswald was being pulled out and being escorted out of the jail to his first court appearance, and they do so in a very public manner. So there is video of this where you can actually see Oswald coming out, and he has a couple police officers on the side of him who are walking with him. And as they come through this large crowd of reporters, suddenly Jack Ruby, who is a local nightclub owner, jumps out with a gun, and he shoots and he kills Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is one reason why there's a lot of conspiracy theories around what happened with the JFK assassination, because Oswald is killed before he can really even talk and tell them why he killed President Kennedy. And the other interesting fact is that Jack Ruby, never tells anybody why he did it. In fact, he takes his rationale for why he did it to his grave. So this is why people constantly look at the Kennedy assassination. They're like, there's a lot of really weird elements to it. Now, I don't buy into conspiracy theories. I am a trained historian. I go by facts, information, reports, and reviewing everything that I've ever been able to see from the Kennedy assassination. It's pretty clear that Oswald was up in the Texas Book Depository, and he acted alone and shot and killed Kennedy. If you guys are interested more, though, there is a lot of videos out there. There is footage of Kennedy as he's driving by and the gunfire itself. There's a live video, of course, if you want to see Jack Ruby assassinate Oswald also. It's not, I mean, when we talk about it being graphic, yes, the man is killed, but it's not like this bloody, horrible scene. It's more just, they cut away from it pretty quickly. But this is what happens and leads to Johnson taking over for Kennedy, and he shifts and shapes the entire face of how the Vietnam War is fought. All right, guys, I know that was really long, and I'm sorry. This is just critical information. Some of these videos are going to be long just because there's a lot to cover. Vietnam holds a very special place for me. I had an uncle who was in Vietnam, and I'll talk about him more on our next unit, okay? All right, so I will see you guys next time.